Konnichiwa minasan, namaskar and a very warm welcome to all present here today. Welcome to the fourth class in the second lecture series on Japanese language and culture. As you all know, we are revising this week, but with revision we are also learning something new. In our last class, we did particle ni with ageru and murau. We also learned how to show purpose with the verb plus ni. So, in this lesson also we will do a little bit of ni, we will do particle to, and we will do some new kanjis, and very quickly we will revise our adjectives. So, let us see what we have today for you. So, as you all know, Japanese has two types of adjectives, I adjectives and na adjectives, and as you already know, I adjectives are of Japanese origin, whereas na adjectives are all foreign words which are used as adjectives in the language. Now, there is another very important thing here, that adjectives have some part of verb in it already. So, that is why we see conjugations like verbs in adjectives as well. So, skato wa akai desu. Akai is an I adjective. Why I? Because they are all ending in I or E, as you can see over here. Then akai skato wa takai desu. It's expensive, or takaku nai desu. And you already know that I, if you remove this from here and put kunai, it becomes negative. So, akai skato wa takaku nai desu. It is not takai. Now, you can also see kanji written over here. We will quickly revise the kanji as well. So, you have it like this. Now, the interesting thing over here is that in olden times it was very difficult to construct a double-storied house. Any house which had two stories like this would be considered high. That's the idea behind making this kanji. And akai is also given over here. So, akai, this is doyobi, you already know. Then 1, 2, 3 and 4, akai. It's not proportionate, but well, you can practice and make it proportionate. Now, Tokyo wa okii desu. You have done this character as dai also in daigaku. So, well, dai over here, and this is Tokyo. You should know the kanji of Tokyo because you are studying Japanese. So, 1, 2, like this, to and Tokyo. So, Tokyo wa okii machi desu. Now, machi is also here. This is a field, and this you can do as a J and join together and make machi, which means city. Tokyo is a big city. Tokyo wa okikute kirei desu. Now, this is what we want to do over here, joining two adjectives, I adjective and na adjective. So, what do you do with the I adjective? Okii takai. Remove the I from here, put kute, which means and you can put another adjective. It could be an I adjective or it could be a na adjective. Both are all right. If it is a na adjective, na is to be used if noun is coming over here. Please remember, if it is just this, then na is not required. So, Tokyo wa okikute kirei desu, or Tokyo wa okikute kirei na machi desu. Now, you have done this, no mai ni, postpositions we did in our last lesson. So, eki no mai ni, in front of the eki, yasukute kirei na mise ga arimasu. There are 2-3 things over here. One is joining two adjectives with kute, which is given over here. Then you have this pattern, place ni, something or someone ga arimasu, or imasu. Then we have more of this. Earlier we did I adjectives plus na or I adjective. Now we are going to do na adjective plus na or I adjective. So, koen wa Shizuka is a na adjective, and after na adjective you will use de as and. It is joining kirei and Shizuka, both na adjectives. Koen wa kirei de, Shizuka desu. Koen is quiet and beautiful. Now, as I told you earlier, if you want to use noun after a na adjective, then na is going to come. This is why they get their name of na adjectives. So, koen wa Shizuka de, this is what we did over here. Kirei na, basho is place, desu. Again, if basho was not there, then kirei desu would have been all right. Kaisha no party wa itsumo nigiyaka de omoshiroi desu. Kaisha no party, itsumo is always, nigiyaka de, nigiyaka is lively, nigiyaka de omoshiroi desu. It is very, very lively and interesting. Then, kino no party wa nigiyaka de omoshirokatta desu. Now, so far it has been in the present tense. Now we have in the past tense. So, how do you make the past tense? Let us see how it is made. We have this word kino over here, thus you get a past tense. Kino, yesterday no party wa nigiyaka de omoshirokatta desu. It was interesting and lively. So, now let us do the past form for adjectives. You can see over here takai, present, takai desu. Remove the I, put kunai desu. Is it okay? Becomes negative, positive, present, positive and present negative. Now, if you go over here, you will see it is katta. So, takai, remove the I again and put katta, taka, katta. It was expensive. Over here, it is expensive. It is not expensive, and takaku nakatta desu. You have takakunai, so remove the I again over here for the past negative, and what do you get? Takaku na katta desu. Now, one thing you will notice over here, that desu is there in all. The tense is not coming from here, the tense is coming from this part. Remember, this will always be there, the tense is being shown from this part. Takai is also here. Now, takai once again. You have another one. This is I adjective and this is na adjective. Na adjective is kirei, kirei desu. Past tense, kirei deshita. And kirei de wa arimasen or kirei janai desu and kirei de wa nakatta desu. Na adjectives are all treated as nouns. So, if you have hon over here, then hon desu, hon deshita. If it is ton and all, then you can say hon deshita. Hon de wa nakatta, it never was a hon, and hon de wa nai, it is not a hon. So, please remember hon de wa nai. Takara, your tense is from this part, and noun and adjectives follow a similar pattern always. Then there is something which you had done earlier, which is the tai form of the verb, verb plus tai, which means you want to do as the verb is saying. And now, why I am getting it over here is just to show you the similarity between the two, as verb tai form is also treated like an adjective. Tabe tai desu. I want to eat. Tabetaku nai desu. Similarly, I is removed and kunai is put over here. Then I is removed and katta is put over here. Tabeta katta. I wanted to eat. and tabetaku nakatta. So I again is removed from here and you get katta. Na katta. Na is already there. So na katta. So please remember that the conjugation is very similar for verb plus tai form and for I adjectives. Now you can see over here, ringo o tabetai desu ka? It's a question. Do you want to eat ringo? Ringo o tabetakatta desu. I wanted to eat a ringo. Ringo o tabetaku nakatta desu. And ringo o tabetaku nai desu. I don't want to eat ringo. So you can see the similarity over here very, very clearly in the tai form and adjectives. Now for you to be able to compare together, I have put it here so you can see the two together. Akai desu is I adjective, akaku nai, akakatta and akaku nakatta. And then you have tabetai with verb and tabetaku nai and tabetaku nakatta and tabeta katta. So please you can compare it and revise at home later. Now we will do something new, which is particle to. Some forms of particle to you have already done. We'll do something new. But first we will revise what we have done. So you know that to is used to join nouns and not sentences, and to means and to also means with. So how are the two going to be done? Let us see. Pen to enpitsu to hon wa tsukue no ue ni arimasu. It is present. Pen and enpitsu and hon are present on the table or are there on the table. Tsukue no ue ni arimasu. You know that. Now in place of pen, enpitsu, hon, you can put any noun over here. So noun plus to, noun plus to, and then position of all of them. Then watashi wa kino Taro-kun to issho ni bijitsukan ni ikimashita. Taro-kun to issho ni. Over here it means with. With Taro-kun I went to the bijitsukan. I went to the art museum. Kino is there, so ikimashita. In place of these two nouns, you can put whatever vocabulary you have and make new sentences. You can also put a ka over here and ask question, did you go? And answer the question. Anata wa kino Taro-kun to issho ni bijitsukan ni ikimashita ka? And make a small conversation. Now, this is and, as you know, this joins nouns. What joins sentences? Soshite. Soshite is also and but joins two sentences. Soshite does not join nouns. And also another thing with soshite is that the thought has to be the same. Kore wa jisho desu. Soshite watashi wa milk o nomimasu. Cannot be done. The thought has to continue. Kore wa jisho desu. Soshite sore wa kyokasho desu. Kore wa budou desu. Soshite sore wa mikan desu or ringo desu. So now earlier we had done particle ni. We will do how to show frequency or number of times a certain activity is performed during a certain period of time, during a certain duration or span. So watashi to haha, watashi and haha wa isshukan ni, in 1 week, in that span of 1 week. Now because it is a span, it is a proper duration, it is defined, thus we can use particle ni over here. Ikkai is once. Kaimono o shimasu. Kaimono is shopping. O shimasu. Over here. O. Watashi to haha. Me and my mother. We do shopping once a week. Ikkai. Number of times we perform an activity. Now you can replace 1週間 with 1日, 1ヶ月, nen, 3日, any of these time expressions, and also 1回, 2回, 3回, 4回, 5回, 6回. So kai is the counter. Once, twice, thrice, 4 times, 5 times, 6 times. And over here, watashi to haha can also be replaced with chichi to haha, imoto to ototo, watashi to oni-san, sensei to gakusei. Any of this can be done and give time span, number of times, and activity is performed. So you can do this very, very easily. Ask and answer. For example, watashi wa 1日に2回歯を磨きます。私は1日に歯を磨きます。私は1日に1回歯を磨きます。or 私は1ヶ月に2回映画を見ます。私は友達と一緒に3日に1回、3日 is 3 days, 3 days, 3日に1回映画を見ます。So me and my friend together we watch a film once in 3 days. So that's the way you can use time expression, number of times an activity, and use particle ni. You can ask a question using ka and answer. Now, something very, very simple but a little tricky. So just see. 私は太郎さんと一緒に食べます。I will eat with Taro san or I will not eat with Taro san. 一緒に is together with. Taro san, question. 一緒に食べましょう. So not asking him, just saying directly, 食べましょう. Let's go. Very, very direct, shows that you are very close to the person. And then, Taro san, 一緒に食べましょうか. Still very informal, but asking the person, shall we go and eat? So this is shall we. Shall we go and eat? Because the verb says eat over here. Now, Taro san, 明日一緒にクラブへ行きませんか? What does this mean? So now, why 行きません over here? Well, when you want to invite somebody, you want to be very polite to somebody, you are requesting somebody to do something for you, then 行きませんか. This 行きませんか is not negative. When the negative of the verb is used with question particle ka, then what happens? It becomes a polite invitation. Please remember that. So, 明日クラブへ行きませんか? Will you please come with me to the club tomorrow? We have done particle to a number of times. Just now we practiced as and, we practiced it as with and together with earlier. So now I want to tell you something new about particle to. It is also used as a quotation marker, which means that it marks the content of the verb like omoimasu. Now what does omoimasu mean? The verb omoimasu means I think or I thought or someone else thinks or thought. So using omoimasu, we can ask someone their opinion or what they think about something or someone. Now one thing you need to remember, that whatever is before to in the sentence, it expresses the content of the thought. Something to omoimasu. Now let us see how it is used. これは田中さんのペンです。This is 田中さん 's pen. Or we can say これは田中さんのペンではありません. It is not 田中さん 's pen. But when I want to say I think it is 田中さん 's pen, then how will I say? So これは田中さんのペンだと思います. Now why da over here? that before to omoimasu, if there is a noun here, noun is used, then da will be used, and da is the plain form for this. これは田中さんの辞書だと思います。これは先生の時計だと思います。So always remember that noun, if it precedes と思います, then da will be used, which is plain for the verb, be verb, this. Pen can be replaced for anything over here, any other noun. Over here we did noun. Over here we have a verb. So what happens this time? Ashita ame ga furu to omoimasu. So with verbs before to omoimasu, it will always be in plain form. Now omoimasu means I think, as I told you, and the particle to be used is to. Now whatever is here is what the person who is saying thinks, or in this case thinks, because it is in present. If it is in past, then he thought. You can also ask a question by adding ka over there. Ashita ame ga furimasu ka? Ashita ame ga furu to omoimasu. I think it is going to rain. Nobody is sure. Now, before to omoimasu, as I told you, verb is going to be in plain form. So, watashi wa iku to omoimasu. Watashi wa ikanai to omoimasu. Kino watashi wa, or kino Tanaka-san wa itta to omoimasu. Kino Tanaka-san wa ikanakatta to omoimasu. So what can you infer from here? Well, that always before to omoimasu, verb is going to be in plain form. And if there is a noun, then what is going to happen? It's going to be da to omoimasu. You can make sentences and practice. Now, これは田中さんのペンではありません. Very, very clear in the negative. So, well, これは田中さんのペンじゃないと思います. As I told you, with と思います, と思う, always da is going to be used. Plain form for this. So, now, if you can see over here, plain form for じゃありません. じゃない. じゃない. So again you have a noun over here. In the negative, じゃないと思います. You cannot have じゃありませんと思います. So always this is going to be in plain form. Present, negative. Now for verb, 明日雨が降らないと思います. So, 降りません and plain form will be 降らないと思います. Always plain form is going to come. And the kanji for 思います is with kokoro. This is the kanji for kokoro and this is the kanji for 思います. It's given over here as well. Now, this is verb, plain form. Miru, minai, mita, and minakatta. Present, negative, present, past, positive, and past, negative. I am giving you very, very simple words, not the dictionary words, so that it is easy for you to understand what is written. Now look at this very carefully. Mimas, miru is mimas, mimasen, mimashita, and mimasen deshita. So try to remember your verbs like this so that you can make all these 8 forms easily. Which group it belongs to? This is group 2, of course. You can have with yomu. So yomi, yomimasu, yomimasen, yomimashita and yomimasen deshita. Yomu, yomanai, yonda and yomanakatta in exactly this manner. So you can use any verb from, this is group 1, any verb from group 1 or group 2 and make mas forms. Now I have some kanjis for you, some similar looking kanjis. Let us see what they are. So well, you have done chikara. Chikara. Chikara means strength. Then you have done man, counter for 10,000 for money, and then kata. So these are the readings. You also have done dai as in daigaku, dai as in daigaku, ki as in mokuyobi or moku also over here, and then you have done hon as in nihon. So now let us see what words we have which will be easy for you to memorize these kanjis. The first one we have is chikara. So you have done this word chikara mochi. Chikara mochi. Chikara zuyoi. Chikara zuyoi. Chikara zuyoi. Chikara zuyoi means you are very, very strong. Chikara mochi is you have strength, and chikara ippai is you have lot of strength. Ippai means lots. Chikara means strength, of course, as you know. Then we will do this hon. This is very, very simple. You have done nihon, which is Japan. Only concentrate on the blue part. It will be easier to remember. Nihon. Now this is honto, really, and hon nin, the real person. The reading for you today is just hon for this character, means book or origin. Now this is kata over here, so we have kata, and if the kanji is repeated, then this is how it is going to be written. You have done the words now. See, kata, gata, or hito, bito, or toki, doki. I am just giving you these characters because you have done the words, but you may not know how to write it. Anytime you see it written, you know how it is to be read. I hope this much is clear and you will be able to make all of this. Chikara is like this. We have done all the stroke orders, so I don't need to repeat it over here. Man, this one is for 10,000. I hope I write it correctly. So ichi man or ni man is the way it is going to be used. Now there are a few more. This is ko, kodomo no ko, ko. Then this is kanji no ji. Kanji is the Chinese characters. Kanji no ji, which means letter, and this means child. Now this means gaku, which is place of learning. We have another set of kanjis over here, similar looking kanjis. So sen, which is 1000. Go, you have done in gogo and gozen, which means afternoon, and then this is ushi. I'll quickly write all of them for you. 3-stroke character, 6-stroke character, then you have gaku, 3, 4, 5, 8-stroke character. Then we have 3-stroke character over here. Then 1, 2, 3 and 4. 4-stroke character for go, and then 1, 2, 3 and 4. 4-stroke character for ushi. Now you will see it's very similar. There is a slight difference. This goes beyond the line and this is under the line. Now let us see how many words we have over here with these characters. So gaku is there, you have done daigaku. This also means, this character here also means oki. Then gakusei you have done gaku and sei. Then we have done gakunen. Gakunen is academic year. Gaku and nen. I would like to tell you one thing. Sometimes my stroke order is a little different from the one given. So try to follow the stroke order given in the chart that I have given in lesson 1. Then this is gakko. Very, very easy. You can see over here roku and then you make chichi. So gakko. Gakko. Now let us see what else do we have. There are a lot of kanjis here I can see. This is kanji itself, means Chinese characters. This blue character is ji over here. Then ji10, ji and 10 means dictionary of Chinese characters or kanjis. Then kodomo, kodomo, this is ko over here, ko. And then we have senri. There is a very nice saying, a very famous saying, which I am going to tell you in your next class. In the meantime, you can also look up the net and see what the saying is. This is senri, meaning measurement for distance. Sen is 1000 and ri is the measurement for distance. Then sen en satsu. Sen en you already know 1000 and satsu is the note. Then you have gyunyu. Gyu is cow, ushi is also cow, and gyunyu is cow's milk. Gyu and nyu. So the Japanese word for miruku is gyunyu. So you can go over the kanjis. You can see all that we have learnt over here. There is particle to. We have revised this. Then there is soshite. There is different usage of particle to, new kanjis, adjectives in their past present forms, all other conjugations with verb tai, which is want. So try to digest this at home today. Do all that we have done, revise, make sentences, questions, ask questions and answer them. Do small kaiwa, and I think it will give you a lot of confidence. So we'll meet again very soon in our next lesson. Till then, study this and try to remember all the vocabulary that we have done. それでは皆さん、今日はここまでにします。また会いましょう。Let's meet again very soon. ありがとうございます。